My daughter-in-law smiled at the man behind the donation center counter and told him to take the whole thing for $50, that the old battered toolbox in the back of her SUV was just useless junk from my garage that she was finally clearing out for me. She had not asked me. She had not opened it. And what neither of them knew, as that $50 bill changed hands on a quiet Saturday morning in September, was that what had been sealed inside the false bottom of that toolbox for 38 years was worth a great deal more than $50, and worth more than money in any case. I am sitting at my kitchen table this morning with a cup of strong black coffee and the kind of October light that comes in slanted through the back window and turns the floorboards the color of warm honey. My name is Alina Hayes. I am 71 years old, a retired master carpenter, and I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in the small craftsman house my husband Theodore and I built with our own hands the year we were married. My knees ache when the weather turns. My hearing is not what it once was, but I am here, and I have learned that being here still after everything is not a small thing. What I want to tell you about is one ordinary Saturday morning in late September that turned out not to be ordinary at all. By the time this story is over, I think you will understand how something I had been keeping quiet for almost 4 decades came back around exactly when it needed to. I retired from carpentry 4 years ago. The last piece I built was a walnut hutch for a young couple in West Asheville expecting their first child. I sanded the corners by hand because my power sander had started to feel too loud in my wrists, and I rubbed the finish in with a cotton cloth instead of a brush, because that was the way my father had taught me when I was 9 years old in his workshop in Pennsylvania. When I delivered the hutch and the young mother ran her hand along the grain and started to cry, I knew it was time. There is a way of leaving a craft you love, and the best way is to leave it on a piece of work you would be proud to put your name on. I drove home that afternoon in the old Ford pickup that Theodore and I had bought used in 1987. The truck has 312,000 miles on it now, and a passenger door that you have to lift slightly before it will close. I had been threatening to replace it for 15 years and I had never done it. Theodore used to say I held onto things past the point of sense, and I would tell him he was the same way about his coffee mugs, and we would let it rest there between us in the way old married people let things rest. Theodore passed 3 years ago this November. A quiet morning, a hand in mine, the same kindness in his eyes he had carried for 46 years. I sat with him for a long time after, and then I walked out to the workshop he and I had shared in the back of the property and stood in the doorway looking at the long workbench where we had built half our life together. I did not cry that day. I have cried plenty since. After Theodore was gone, my son Marcus and his wife Camille began coming around more often. At first I thought it was kindness. I'm old enough now to know that the first reading of a thing is not always the right one. Marcus is 43 years old, a software project manager at a firm downtown, and he has my husband's eyes, that particular pale gray that goes silver in certain light. As a boy, he used to sit on a stool in the workshop and hand me nails one at a time from a coffee can while I worked. He would count them out loud, then lose count, then start over without frustration. He had patience then. I am not sure when he started to lose it, but I think it was some time after he met Camille. Camille is 41 and works in what she calls lifestyle curation, which as far as I have been able to gather means she helps wealthy people in Charlotte and Atlanta decide what to put on their shelves and what to throw away. She has a careful way of speaking, the way certain people speak when they have learned that softness is more effective than sharpness for getting what they want. She always called me a leaner instead of any version of mother, and I appreciated that at first because it felt honest. Later, I came to understand it differently. They started visiting every other Sunday after Theodore died, sometimes more often. Camille would bring a casserole I did not need and walk through the rooms of the house with her phone in her hand, taking small, unobtrusive photographs she thought I did not notice. Marcus would sit at the kitchen table and ask me about my health, my finances, whether the house was getting to be too much for me, whether I had thought about what I wanted to do with the workshop now that Theodore was gone. I would answer briefly and change the subject, and he would let me. What I noticed, the way you notice a draft in a room before you find the open window, was that Marcus had stopped looking at me directly when he asked me questions. He looked at Camille first, just a brief glance, the way a man checks the weather before he decides whether to put on a jacket. I had watched my husband for 46 years, and he had never once done that. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself this for almost 2 years. Last spring, Camille began bringing up the workshop in particular. She said the building was beautiful, but that it was a shame to see it sitting unused, that all those tools and all that lumber and all those bins of what she called old metal odds and ends were just collecting dust. She said her sister knew a man in Charlotte who bought up old workshops and gave fair prices for the contents. She said it might be nice to clear the space and turn it into something useful, a guest cottage perhaps, or a rental. I told her the workshop was fine the way it was. I told her I still went out there most afternoons and worked on small projects, that I had built 2 cradles last winter for a friend's grandchildren, and was halfway through a jewelry box for the neighbor's daughter. I told her I was not in any hurry to dismantle what Theodore and I had spent a lifetime putting together. She smiled and nodded and changed the subject to a recipe she had been wanting to try. But 2 weeks later she brought it up again, and 2 weeks after that. Each time gently, each time with a slightly different angle, and each time I would redirect her, and each time Marcus would say nothing. He sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded around his coffee cup, and he let his wife speak for both of them, and he looked at the table or out the window or at his phone, but he did not look at me. That was when I started to pay attention in a different way. I have lived a long time, and one of the things a long life teaches you is that people do not usually announce their intentions out loud. They reveal them slowly, in the small accumulating gestures that are easy to dismiss one at a time and impossible to ignore once you start adding them together. So I started adding them together. I kept a small notebook in the drawer of the kitchen hutch, the same brand of black moleskine I had used for sketching furniture designs when I was still working. I began writing things down, the dates Marcus and Camille visited, what questions they asked, what rooms Camille walked through and how long she spent in each one, which of my possessions she stopped to examine. The way she would sometimes pick up a tool from the workshop bench, turn it over in her hand, ask what it was used for, and set it down again with a small dismissive smile, as if the answer had confirmed something she already suspected. I noticed that she paid particular attention to the toolbox. It was an old red Craftsman box that sat on the floor under the south window of the workshop. The paint had chipped along the corners, and the latch had a dent in it from the time Theodore dropped a length of oak on it in 1992. To anyone walking through the workshop quickly, it would have looked like exactly what Camille kept calling it: junk. An old battered box full of bent nails and rusty pliers and odds and ends that no longer served any purpose. She did not know what was sealed inside the false bottom of that toolbox. She did not know because Theodore and I had never told anyone. Not Marcus, not the neighbors, not the lawyer who had helped us draw up our wills. We had built the false bottom together one weekend in the autumn of 1986, the year Marcus was 3 years old, and Theodore had just come home from the funeral of his oldest brother, and we had sat down at the kitchen table and talked about what we wanted to do with the thing his brother had left us. We had decided together. We had put it in the box together, and we had not spoken of it since. I will tell you what was in there, but not yet. The order of a story matters, and I want you to understand the shape of what was happening above the false bottom before I tell you what was sleeping underneath it. In late August, Marcus came over alone on a Wednesday afternoon. This was unusual. He almost never came without Camille anymore, and never in the middle of the work week. He sat at the kitchen table and would not meet my eyes and asked me how I was feeling, whether I was sleeping all right, whether the property taxes had gone up again this year. I poured him a cup of coffee and waited. Eventually, he said that Camille was worried about me. He said she had been talking with her sister about how isolated I was, how the house was too big for one person, how the workshop was a hazard with all those sharp tools and heavy materials. He said they had been looking at some assisted living communities in the area, just looking, just to know what was out there, and that there was a particularly nice one in Hendersonville that had a waiting list, and that perhaps it would be worth my time to come tour it with them, just to see. I looked at my son across the table. I looked at the boy who had once handed me nails one at a time from a coffee can, now a grown man who could not bring himself to look at his own mother while he said what he was saying. I told him I would think about it. He left 20 minutes later. After Marcus left that Wednesday, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. The coffee in his cup had gone cold across from me, and I watched a fly land on the rim and walk slowly around it and lift off again. I was not angry. Anger is a fast emotion, and what I was feeling was slow, the way grief is slow, the way the understanding of something you have been avoiding is slow. I had known. I think I had known for months. But there is a particular kind of knowing that you hold at arm's length because letting it close to you means you have to do something about it, and I had not been ready to do anything about it yet. That afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the fly and the late summer light coming through the window above the sink, I let it close. I called my friend Harriet that evening. Harriet is 74, a retired estate attorney who lives 3 streets over and who has known me since 1979 when she and her late husband moved into the neighborhood. I told her what was happening. I told her about the workshop conversations, the assisted living facility, the way Marcus had stopped looking at me when he spoke. I did not mention the toolbox or what was in it. I was not ready to mention that to anyone yet. Harriet listened without interrupting, the way she always had. When I finished, she said something that has stayed with me. She said that in her 38 years of practice, the cases that broke her heart the most were never the ones where the family members were strangers. They were the ones where the people involved had once loved each other genuinely and had let something else get in the way. She said the question I needed to ask myself was not whether Marcus loved me. The question was whether he still had the courage to act on that love when it cost him something at home. I told her I did not know the answer to that question yet. She told me to come to her office on Friday morning. She said she wanted to take a careful look at my current will, my power of attorney documents, and the deed to the house. She said it would not hurt to make sure everything was clean and protected before I made any decisions about anything else. I went to her office that Friday. I sat across from her at the same mahogany desk where Theodore and I had signed our wills 22 years earlier, and Harriet walked me through every document carefully. The house was in my name alone, free and clear. The will I had updated after Theodore's death named Marcus as the primary beneficiary, with a clause regarding any future spouse he might have, which at the time of writing had been theoretical. Harriet looked at me over her reading glasses and asked me whether I wanted to revisit that clause. I told her I needed to think about it. She nodded and set the document aside. Then she asked me whether there were any other assets she should know about, anything outside the standard inventory, any property of significance that was not on the books. I sat across from her for a long moment. The clock on her wall ticked. The September sun came through the window behind her and lit the dust motes in the air between us. I had not told anyone about the toolbox in 38 years. Theodore and I had agreed in 1986 that some things were meant to be held quietly, that the safest place for certain truths was the smallest number of people necessary. But Theodore was gone, and I was sitting across from Harriet, and Harriet had never once in 46 years given me a reason to doubt her. I told her about the toolbox. Harriet listened without changing her expression. When I had finished telling her what was sealed inside the false bottom and how it had come to be there, she took off her reading glasses and set them carefully on the desk and folded her hands in front of her. She asked me whether I had any documentation. I told her I did. I told her Theodore had kept the original paperwork in a safety deposit box at the credit union on Merriman Avenue, and that I had the key in the kitchen drawer at home, and that I had not opened the box since 2 weeks after the funeral when I had gone to retrieve his death certificate. Harriet asked if I would be willing to go to the credit union that same afternoon and bring her the contents. I said yes. I drove to the credit union and signed in, and the young woman at the desk led me back to the small private room where the safety deposit boxes were kept. She turned my key and her key in the two locks and pulled out the long metal drawer and left me alone with it and closed the door behind her. I sat down at the small table and opened the lid. There were 3 documents inside, each in its own clear plastic sleeve. The first was a letter of provenance from a dealer in Philadelphia dated October 14, 1986, signed by a man named Joseph Bernstein. The second was an appraisal from the same dealer dated the same day. The third was a notarized statement of ownership signed by Theodore's older brother, Walter, 3 months before he died, transferring the items in question to Theodore and to me jointly with full knowledge and consent of all parties. I had not looked at these documents in 38 years. I sat at the small table in the small private room at the credit union and I read them all the way through, and when I finished, I sat for a few more minutes with my hands flat on the table before I gathered them up. I drove the documents back to Harriet's office. She read each one slowly, the way she read everything. When she finished the third one, she looked up at me and asked me a question. She asked me when the appraisal had last been updated. I told her it had not been updated since 1986. We had never seen any reason to update it. We had not been planning to sell. We had not been planning to do anything with the contents at all. The whole point had been simply to keep them safe, to honor what Walter had wanted, and to make sure that one day, when the moment was right, the items would go to whoever Theodore and I judged would understand what they were and treat them properly. Harriet asked if she could make a phone call. She said she knew an appraiser in Charlotte who specialized in exactly this kind of item and who could be trusted absolutely. I said yes. She made the call. The appraiser, a woman named Diane Park, agreed to drive to Asheville the following Tuesday morning to examine the items in person at Harriet's office. Harriet asked me whether I would be comfortable bringing the toolbox itself to her office on Monday so that everything would be ready. I said yes. I drove home that Friday evening with the September light going long and gold across the Blue Ridge Mountains, and I parked the truck in the gravel driveway, and I walked out to the workshop. The toolbox was where it had always been, under the south window. I lifted it carefully. It is heavier than it looks, and I had to set it down twice on the way back to the house. I set it on the floor of the spare bedroom and closed the door behind me. That was Friday. Marcus and Camille were coming over for Sunday lunch. I want to stop here for a moment, because what happened that Sunday is the part of the story that still surprises me when I think about it. Even now, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee and the October light coming in through the back window, I had decided I would not say anything about the toolbox. I had decided I would let the Sunday lunch happen the way Sunday lunches had been happening for 2 years. I would make a roast chicken and rosemary potatoes. I would set the table with the blue plates Theodore and I had bought on our honeymoon in Charleston. I would let Marcus and Camille walk into my house and sit at my table and eat my food and ask me their questions, and I would watch them the way I had been watching them, and I would learn whatever there was still to learn. But that morning, while I was peeling potatoes at the kitchen sink, I heard the gravel crunch in the driveway. I looked at the clock. It was 9:15. They were not expected until noon. I dried my hands on the dish towel and walked to the front window. Camille's white SUV was parked in the drive and Camille was already out of the vehicle. Marcus was still in the passenger seat looking down at his phone. Camille was walking not toward the front door but around the side of the house, toward the workshop. I stood at the window and watched her. She had a clipboard in her hand. She had brought a clipboard. She tried the workshop door. It was unlocked. I never locked it because there was nothing inside worth stealing, or so anyone walking through would have assumed. She went inside. I could see her shape through the dusty window, moving slowly along the workbench, stopping here and there, making notes on her clipboard. She opened cabinets. She lifted the lids of bins. She did not touch much, but she looked at everything. And then she walked over to the south window, and she bent down, and she picked up the red Craftsman toolbox. Except, of course, she did not pick it up, because the toolbox was not in the workshop anymore. It was in the spare bedroom of my house, where I had placed it Friday evening. What she picked up was a different toolbox entirely. An empty one. An old gray Husky box I had bought at a yard sale 15 years earlier and had been meaning to give away ever since. I had moved it into the workshop on Saturday morning. I had set it exactly where the red Craftsman box had been sitting for 38 years. I had done it without quite knowing why. Call it instinct. Call it the same quiet attention I had been paying to small things for the past several months. I had simply felt, the way you feel the temperature drop before a storm, that something was going to happen sooner than I thought. I watched Camille lift the gray box and weigh it in her hand. I watched her face change slightly. She had been expecting it to be heavier. She opened the lid and looked inside. The box was empty. I had emptied it the day before. I watched her stand there for a moment, holding the empty toolbox, looking at it. Then she set it down. She made another note on her clipboard. She walked out of the workshop and around the side of the house, and a moment later there was a knock on the front door. I dried my hands again and went to answer it. Camille was smiling. She apologized for being early. She said she had hoped to get a head start on helping me organize the workshop while Marcus and I caught up. She held up the clipboard and gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. I led her into the kitchen. I made coffee and offered her a cup. She accepted with the same warm smile she had been wearing for 2 years, and she sat at the kitchen table the way she always did, in the chair closest to the back window. Marcus came in a few minutes later and kissed me on the cheek and asked how I was. He still did not look at me directly when he asked. We talked about small things for a while. The weather, a new restaurant downtown, a documentary Marcus had been watching about the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge. Camille was patient. She waited until I had refilled the coffee cups and sat back down before she brought up the workshop. She said she had taken just a quick look while she was waiting for me to come to the door, and that she could really see now what she had been trying to describe for the past few months. She said the space had so much potential, but that it was being weighed down by all those old materials and tools that I was not using anymore. She said she had a contact, a man who ran a donation center on the east side of town that benefited a veterans organization, and that he had told her he would be willing to come pick up the entire contents of the workshop in his truck and give me a tax receipt for the value, and that the proceeds would go to a good cause. She said all of this in a single, uninterrupted flow, the way she said most things, in the warm, even tone of someone who had practiced the words in the car on the way over. I asked her when she had been in touch with this man. She said she had spoken with him last Tuesday. I asked her whether she had described the contents to him. She said she had given him a general sense. I asked her whether she had told him about any specific items. She paused for the first time. She looked at Marcus. Marcus was looking at the table. I told her I appreciated her thinking of me, but that I was not ready to dismantle the workshop. I told her there were items in there that had sentimental value, and that I would prefer to go through everything myself slowly over the coming year and decide what to keep and what to give away. Camille nodded thoughtfully. She said of course, she understood completely. She said she had only been trying to help. She said perhaps we could just identify the most obvious items, the things that were clearly junk, just to make a start. She mentioned the red toolbox specifically. She said she had noticed it sitting under the south window and that it looked like it had been there forever, and that surely there was nothing in there I still needed. She offered, very generously, to take it off my hands that very afternoon. She said the donation center would give her $50 for it without even looking inside. She laughed lightly. She said it would be one small thing off my plate. I looked at her across the kitchen table. I looked at my son sitting beside her with his hands folded around his coffee cup. The clock on the wall ticked. The pot of potatoes simmered on the stove. I told her she was welcome to take the toolbox. She blinked. She had not been expecting me to say yes that quickly. She recovered after a half-second and smiled and said wonderful, that she would put it in the SUV right after lunch, that she was so glad I was open to letting go of some of the clutter. I served the roast chicken. We ate. Marcus complimented the potatoes. Camille asked about the rosemary, whether it was from the garden. I told her it was. After lunch, she walked out to the workshop with a confident step, and she came back carrying the gray Husky toolbox, and she put it in the back of her SUV. I watched her from the kitchen window. She did not open it. They left around 2:30. Camille hugged me at the door and told me she would let me know how much the donation center gave her, that she would bring the receipt by next weekend so I could claim the deduction. Marcus hugged me too, and for the first time in a long time, I felt him hold on just a beat longer than usual. Then he stepped back and they got into the SUV and they drove away. I stood at the front window and watched them go. When the SUV had turned the corner at the end of the street, I went to the kitchen and sat down at the table and put my hands flat on the surface and breathed out slowly. I was not triumphant. I had not enjoyed any part of what had just happened. There is no satisfaction in confirming a thing you have hoped you were wrong about. But I had needed to know, and now I knew. Camille had walked into my workshop without my permission and inventoried it on a clipboard, and she had taken what she believed to be a 38-year-old toolbox from my late husband's workbench, and she had not paused for a moment to consider that it might have meant something to me. She had not even opened it. That was the part that stayed with me. She had not even opened it. The following morning, Monday, I drove the red Craftsman toolbox to Harriet's office. I carried it in carefully through the front door and set it on the spare desk in her conference room, and Harriet looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then she said it looked exactly the way I had described it. Worn. Ordinary. The kind of thing nobody would look at twice. She asked me whether I wanted to be present when Diane Park, the appraiser, opened it the next morning. I told her yes. I spent that Monday evening at home. I made myself a simple supper of eggs and toast and ate it at the kitchen table watching the light change in the back garden. I thought about Theodore. I thought about the autumn weekend in 1986 when we had built the false bottom together, and how he had laughed and called it our pirate treasure, and how I had told him it was not pirate treasure. It was something more important than that, and how he had grown serious and agreed. Walter had been Theodore's older brother. He had served in the Navy in the Pacific in the early 1940s and had come home a quiet man. He had never married. He had worked his whole adult life as a curator at a small museum in Philadelphia, and when he died at 58 from a cancer that took him in less than 4 months, he had left Theodore and me a wooden crate containing 4 items he had personally collected and authenticated over the course of 3 decades. He had left them to us, he wrote in his final letter, because he trusted us to know what to do with them, and because he did not trust the museum or the auction houses or even the rest of his own family to treat them with the dignity they deserved. I will tell you what the items were now, because the moment has arrived in the story for you to know. There were 2 early American silver pieces, a porringer and a small can, both made by Paul Revere in his Boston shop between 1772 and 1778, both bearing his mark, both with documented provenance going back to the original families who had commissioned them. There was a sealed letter, in its original wax, written by John Adams to a Boston cousin in 1791, never opened, never publicly known to exist. And there was a small hand-bound volume of poems, in Emily Dickinson's own handwriting, given by her in 1882 to a neighbor's child as a gift, and never catalogued by any scholar in the 144 years since. These were the items that had been sealed inside the false bottom of a battered red Craftsman toolbox in my workshop for 38 years. Diane Park arrived at Harriet's office on Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock. She was a small woman in her 50s with silver hair pulled back into a careful knot, and the kind of focused attention you learn to recognize in people who have spent their lives looking at things very carefully. She set her case on the conference room table and asked permission before she touched the toolbox. I gave it. She removed the upper tray. She removed the bent nails and the rusty pliers and the assorted odds and ends that Theodore and I had carefully arranged on top of the false bottom 38 years ago to make the box look exactly like what Camille had assumed it was. She found the small recessed catch in the back left corner, the one Theodore had cut by hand with a router. She pressed it. The false bottom lifted. She did not gasp. She did not exclaim. She simply went very still for a long moment, and then she put on a pair of white cotton gloves from her case, and she lifted each item out one at a time and laid it on the soft cloth Harriet had spread across the table. The porringer first, then the can, then the sealed letter, then the small bound volume of poems. She worked for nearly 4 hours. She used a jeweler's loupe and a small portable scale and a digital camera and a magnifier on a stand she had brought with her. She made notes in a leather-bound book. She asked me questions about Walter, about how he had acquired each piece, about whether there was any documentation, and I gave her the 3 documents from the safety deposit box, and she read them carefully. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, she set down her tools and removed her gloves and folded her hands on the table. She said that the silver pieces were authentic and that their current auction value, given their provenance and condition, would be somewhere between $400,000 and $600,000 for the pair. She said the John Adams letter, if its contents proved to be of historical significance once opened by qualified scholars, could be worth between $200,000 and $1 million depending on what it said. She said the Dickinson volume was, in her professional judgment, one of the most significant unpublished literary discoveries of the past 50 years, and that she could not even begin to estimate its value because nothing comparable had come to market in her lifetime. She paused. She said the total, conservatively, was in the low millions. She said it could go considerably higher. I sat at the conference table and looked at the 4 items laid out on the soft cloth. I thought about Walter, who had spent 30 years quietly collecting them. I thought about Theodore, who had built the false bottom with his own hands. I thought about Camille, who had driven away 2 days earlier with an empty gray toolbox in the back of her SUV. Harriet asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I needed a few days to think about it. I drove home that afternoon. I parked the truck in the gravel driveway and walked out to the workshop. I stood in the doorway for a long time and looked at the workbench where Theodore and I had built half our life together. I walked over to the south window where the toolbox had sat for 38 years. The space was empty now. The gray husky box was somewhere on Camille's side of town, in a donation center, or in a dumpster, or sitting on a shelf with a $50 price tag. I sat down on the stool by the workbench. I sat there until the light went long and gold through the dusty window. I thought about my son. I thought about who he had been at 9 years old, counting nails into a coffee can. I thought about who he had become, and I made a decision. The following Saturday, I invited Marcus to lunch. Just Marcus. I told him on the phone that there was something I needed to discuss with him alone, and that I would appreciate it if he came without Camille. He hesitated on the line for a moment and then he said yes. He arrived at noon. I had made vegetable soup and crusty bread, the way I had made it for him when he was a child and homesick from school. He sat at the kitchen table and ate slowly. He did not ask me what I needed to discuss. I think he already knew, the way children always know, even grown children, when their mother has come to the end of waiting. When we had finished eating, I cleared the bowls and brought the red Craftsman toolbox to the table. I set it down in front of him. He looked at it. He looked at me. I told him what was inside. I told him about Walter, about 1986, about the false bottom, about the 38 years of quiet. I told him what Diane Park had said on Tuesday afternoon. I told him about the gray husky box. I told him that I had watched Camille walk through my workshop with a clipboard, and that I had watched him sit in the passenger seat of the SUV looking at his phone while she did it. He did not interrupt me. When I finished, he sat very still for a long moment, and then he put his face in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. He cried the way a 43-year-old man cries when he has finally let himself feel something he has been refusing to feel for years. I sat across the table from him and I let him. When he could speak again, he told me that he had known something was wrong for a long time. He said that Camille had been talking about my house and my workshop and my finances for over a year now, that she had been pushing him to push me, that he had let her because it was easier than the alternative. He said he had told himself he was protecting me, that the assisted living conversation was for my own good, that the workshop was a hazard. He said he had not believed any of it, not really, but that he had let himself say it anyway. He said he was sorry. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I had always loved him. I told him that love was not the question. The question was what he was going to do now. He filed for divorce 3 weeks later. The proceedings are still ongoing as I sit here this morning with my coffee. Camille has hired a lawyer and is contesting certain assets. The $50 Toolbox transaction, as it turns out, is documented on the donation center's records with her signature on it, and Harriet tells me it may become relevant before everything is finished. We will see. The 4 items from the false bottom are now in a secure facility in Charlotte, awaiting auction in the spring. Diane Park is handling the sale. The proceeds, when they come, will go into a trust I have established in Theodore's name. Part of it will fund a scholarship for young carpenters at the technical college, where I taught evening classes for 15 years. Part of it will go to a small museum in Philadelphia where Walter once worked, to endow a quiet room in his name. And part of it will be held for Marcus, to be released to him on a slow schedule over many years, the way you give water to a plant that has been thirsty for a long time. He sat at my kitchen table again last Sunday. He brought his own coffee mug this time, an old chipped one of Theodore's that he had asked if he could take after the funeral and had never used until now. He drank from it slowly. He looked at me when I spoke. Sometimes the people we love most lose their way for a while, and the only thing left to do is to keep your own way clear, and to wait, and to hope they find their way back. If this story stayed with you, I hope it reminds you that what matters most is rarely what looks valuable from the outside. Thank you for sitting with me through all of it. If you would like to hear more stories like this one, subscribing is the best way to make sure you do not miss what comes next.